there was only extraction. German ships began hauling trapped troops away from the pocket and moving them to Pillau, farther along the East Prussian coast. Großdeutschland, mauled and exhausted, was pulled out by sea and replaced in the line by the worn 95th Infantry Division. That detail matters. The most favored division in the German army had been reduced to a formation that needed relief from ordinary infantry. The fire brigade had burned down too far to keep standing in the doorway. But evacuation was not salvation. It was only a transfer to the next pocket. While Memel was being squeezed, another Soviet blow was striking toward East Prussia itself. The Third Belarusian Front under Ivan Chernyakhovsky opened the Gumbinnen-Goldap operation in October 1944, driving into the fortified border zone and toward Königsberg, the old Prussian capital. This was the first real Soviet assault into German soil. The Germans fought with a desperation that came from more than military necessity. East Prussia was symbolic ground. It was homeland ground. The border had bunkers, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and a kind of emotional weight no map symbol could show. And Großdeutschland was no longer a single armored fist. It was being used in fragments. A battle group here, a few tanks there, infantry sent to stiffen one weak place, armor sent to retake another village. Command elements shifted again because another piece of front was bending. That is how an elite division dies before it is destroyed. Not all at once. Not always in a dramatic encirclement. Sometimes it dies by being broken into useful pieces until the whole thing no longer exists as a whole. An armored division is most dangerous when it concentrates its tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and command system into one blow. Scatter it into crisis packets, and it becomes locally dangerous, but operationally helpless. The fighting around Gumbinnen and Goldap showed that perfectly. Soviet forces took Gumbinnen on October 22nd. German counterattacks, including armor and heavy tank strength, clawed it back 2 days later. Goldap fell to the Soviet 31st Army on October 28th, then was retaken in early November. So yes, the Germans could still win back towns. That was the trap in the evidence. They could win places and lose the war by winning them. Every tiger committed to retaking a border town was a tiger that might not exist for the next collapse. Every veteran killed in a counterattack was a man no replacement pool could truly replace. Every local recovery strengthened the illusion that the front could still be restored, while underneath it the arithmetic had already turned fatal. Behind a Soviet army that took losses, another formation could be rebuilt, shifted, and launched again. Behind a German tiger loss, there was often only a repair shop without parts, or a line in a report. By March 15, 1945, the numbers told the truth more brutally than any speech could. The division that had stood near 160 tanks the previous year could now field 1 assault gun, 1 Panzer IV, 5 Panthers, 6 Tigers, 13 armored vehicles. From armored fist to weak company. Manpower told the same story. From nearly 20,000 men at its height, the division was down to roughly 4,000. 4 out of 5 had been killed, wounded, captured, transferred, or lost to the chaos of retreat. The showpiece was now mostly a name moving through the wreckage of East Prussia, and the final Soviet offensive made sure there would be nowhere left for that name to hide. On January 13, 1945, the Great East Prussian Offensive opened. This time, the German defense did not merely bend. It shattered into coastal pockets around Königsberg, Samland, and the ports still holding evacuation routes over the Baltic. The Soviet method that had trapped Memel now appeared across the province at scale. Concentrate, break through, drive to the coast, split the defense, reduce each pocket in turn. Germany once built a division so privileged, it looked less like a fighting unit and more like a promise. Nearly 20,000 men, rows of Panthers, a battalion of Tigers, the first pick of equipment before ordinary panzer divisions even saw it. Its name was Großdeutschland, and by the spring of 1945, that same division could count its armored strength on one hand and then borrow the other. 6 working Tigers, 5 Panthers, 1 assault gun, 1 Panzer IV. The Army's showpiece had been pushed against the cold edge of the Baltic Sea, cut into pieces, and reduced to a few thousand exhausted men waiting for ships that might never come. What destroyed it was not one heroic charge, not one famous duel. Around Balga, thousands of Großdeutschland men were surrounded, and about 4,000 made their way across to Pillau for the last stand. But that stand was not about victory. It was about time. Time for soldiers to get out. Time for refugees to reach ships. Time for a harbor to function under shellfire a few more hours. The division that once received Germany's newest tanks before anyone else was now protecting an evacuation lane at the end of a collapsing world. The numbers around East Prussia became almost too large to feel. Soviet claims for the Samland fighting alone ran to tens of thousands of German troops killed or captured. Across the East Prussian defense, German losses reached into the hundreds of thousands killed, missing, or taken. This was not maneuver anymore. This was compression. Every pocket smaller than the last, every road more crowded, every port more important, every escape route narrower than the number of people trying to use it. Then came Pillau. On April 25, 1945, the Soviet 11th Guards Army stormed the area. The last German stronghold in East Prussia was cleared in roughly 12 hours. 12 hours. After years of being treated as Germany's emergency weapon, after Vilkaviskas, Memel, Gumbinnen, Goldap, Balga, and the frozen retreat to the sea, the final position tied to the survivors of Großdeutschland collapsed between sunrise and sunset. Only about 800 men from the division managed to escape across the Baltic. They would later surrender to the British in Schleswig-Holstein on May 9, 1945. 800. From merely 20,000. From a division built around Panthers and Tigers, from the Army's banner formation. The rest were dead, missing, or in Soviet captivity. That is the real ending of Großdeutschland. Not an explosion, not a last charge fit for a poster, not an elite unit defeated by another elite unit in a fair contest. It ended as math. The Soviets did not need to prove that a T-34 was better than a Tiger in every possible duel. They did not need to outshine Großdeutschland's reputation. They only needed to make reputation irrelevant. They chose the weak seam. They concentrated weight where Germany was thin. They broke through where the elite division was not able to decide the issue. They drove to the water faster than the Germans could rebuild a front. They cut the pocket down to ships, sand, and artillery delays. Then they kept pressing until the showpiece became 13 armored vehicles, 4,000 exhausted men, and finally, 800 survivors. That is why the destruction matters. Großdeutschland was supposed to prove what Germany could do when it gave one formation everything. The best tanks, the best men, the first priority, the proudest name. The Red Army proved something harsher. A single superb division cannot be a strategy. It cannot hold every seam. It cannot replace its own dead. It cannot be concentrated if it is constantly scattered. It cannot defeat an enemy that chooses the place of decision and brings enough force to make all local excellence meaningless. In the end, the Fire Brigade was not beaten because it forgot how to fight. It was beaten because the fire became larger than any brigade. And once the grinder closed around East Prussia, even Germany's proudest division was just another formation trapped on the wrong side of the map. The name remained on paper. The division did not. Not one single battle that made the maps look dramatic. It was a method. Find the seam, stack the weight, break the crust, race to the water, seal the pocket, then make time do the killing. This is how the Red Army took the German Army's most pampered division and fed it into the grinder until the name Großdeutschland meant almost nothing but survivors. Before the grinder closed, that name still carried weight. Großdeutschland was not just another division in Feldgrau. It was the Army's display case. The formation Berlin could point to when it wanted to show what a German unit looked like when the supply system favored it instead of starving it. Better rations, better replacements, better officers, better equipment. When new armored vehicles came forward, this division was among the first in line. When the Army wanted a formation with political symbolism and battlefield muscle, this was the one it had built for that purpose. Even the name was a statement. Greater Germany. Not a province. Not a number. A banner. That banner came with expectations. By late 1943, Großdeutschland had earned the nickname that would follow it to the end. The Fire Brigade. Die Feuerwehr. Whenever the Eastern Front started cracking in some dangerous place, this was the unit thrown into the smoke. A Soviet breakthrough near one army, a crisis near another, a sector where the line was bending faster than headquarters could understand it. Großdeutschland moved. At first, that made the division look almost supernatural. It arrived where things were already bad, counterattacked, and sometimes restored a front that should have collapsed. That is how legends form in wartime, not because a unit is untouched, but because it keeps appearing at the exact place everyone else is failing. But a fire brigade pays for its reputation in fuel, metal, and men. It does not rest. It does not rebuild properly. It does not sit on quiet ground long enough for replacements to become veterans. It is always running toward the worst fire on the map. And by 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer a line with fires on it. It was becoming one enormous fire. In May 1944, Großdeutschland still looked terrifying on paper. The books listed 14 Panzer IVs, 90 Panthers, 40 Tiger I tanks, and roughly 40 assault guns. Add the manpower, and the division approached 20,000 men. That was the kind of strength ordinary formations could only dream about. One division had enough armored weight to look like a small army. The officer who had helped build that monster was Hasso von Manteuffel, a rising armored commander who took over in February 1944. Under him, the division carried the kind of tank strength German propaganda liked to imagine was still normal. 1 battalion of Tigers, multiple Panther battalions, veteran infantry around them. It was a steel fist. But Manteuffel would not be the man forced to hold that fist together at the end. By September, he had moved on to higher command, and Karl Lorenz inherited the division just as the Red Army prepared to tear apart the entire eastern position. That was the cruel timing. The strongest version of Großdeutschland existed right before strength stopped being enough. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet offensives rolled west with a force no German emergency unit could contain. The front was no longer being dented. It was being unstitched. The Red Army was driving toward East Prussia, the old military heartland, the place tied to the officer class, the symbol of German army tradition. This was not occupied territory being lost. This was the road to German soil. So Berlin reached for its best remaining instrument. Großdeutschland was pulled out of Army Group South Ukraine and rushed north toward Lithuania and East Prussia. The order was simple, in the way impossible orders are simple. Stop the Soviet advance before it reaches Germany. At first, the division still seemed to have some of the old magic. In August, it counterattacked near Vilkaviskis and briefly clawed the town back from Soviet forces. A local success, a flash of the old fire brigade. A door slammed shut for a moment, but the hinges were already broken. The fighting cost tanks the German army could not replace. A Panther lost in Lithuania was not just a battlefield loss. It was a piece of a shrinking industrial miracle that would not be made whole again. Every local success was being bought with armor the division needed for the next disaster. Then came the attempts to keep German forces in the Baltic connected, especially as the 16th and 18th armies were being pushed toward isolation in Courland. Großdeutschland fought to keep corridors open. It counterattacked. It shifted. It patched. It bled. But the old system was collapsing faster than any single elite unit could repair it. And while the division was being spent in emergency after emergency, the Soviets were preparing something colder than a frontal shove. They were looking for the joint. By October 1944, the German 3rd Panzer Army, with Großdeutschland within the broader sector, sat across a dangerous seam between Army Group Center and Army Group North. On a map, seams look harmless. A line touches another line. Two commands meet. In war, that meeting point is often the place nobody owns strongly enough. One headquarters thinks the other is covering it. One reserve is promised to two crises. One weak division is expected to hold what a strong one could barely manage. The Soviet commander Hovhannes Bagramian saw that weakness clearly. He commanded the First Baltic Front, and he did not try to win everywhere at once. That was the German mistake now, trying to hold every mile with strength that no longer existed. Bagramian did the opposite. He took a massive share of his front, up to half of its force, and packed it into a narrow sector west of Schalienn, roughly 12 miles of ground. Half a front, 12 miles. That is what operational violence looks like before the shooting starts. The Germans were thin because they were trying to be present everywhere. The Soviets were willing to be weaker elsewhere so they could be overwhelming at the one place chosen to break. And the place chosen to break was held by the 551st Volksgrenadier Division, a late war formation scraped together from men Germany still had available. Older men, recovering wounded, rear area personnel, replacements with thin training and thinner confidence. This was not the kind of unit that could absorb a concentrated Soviet hammer. Bagramian had aimed that hammer at the softest plank in the door. On October 5, 1944, the bombardment began. The purpose was not just to frighten defenders. It was to take the front line apart physically before the assault troops reached it. Dugouts smashed, wire cut, communications broken, men stunned, buried, deafened, or dead before they understood where the main blow had landed. Then the Soviet armies moved forward. The 551st cracked on the first day. By nightfall, the Red Army had driven roughly 10 miles into the German line. 10 miles in one day. On the Eastern Front, where a single village could become a week of killing, that was not an advance. That was rupture. And rupture only mattered because Bagramian had the next blow already waiting behind it. A breakthrough without exploitation is just a wound. A breakthrough with armor behind it becomes an amputation. Into the gap went the 5th Guards Tank Army under Volsky, aimed toward the Baltic coast north of Memel. Around it and behind it pressed the 43rd Army, the 51st Army, the 4th Shock Army, the 6th Guards Army, and the 39th Army from the neighboring 3rd Belarusian Front. Army after army pushed through the same torn opening. This was not a duel with Großdeutschland. It was not a contest of Panther against T-34, Tiger against Gunline. The Soviets had built a situation where Germany's best division was not at the decisive spot in decisive strength when the spot broke. That was the point. Within 2 days, Soviet spearheads reached the Baltic. The moment those tanks touched the coast, the map changed. Army Group North was cut from East Prussia and the rest of the German front. Memel became a pocket. The German units north of the breach were no longer holding a continuous line. They were trapped pieces on the wrong side of Soviet armor. And somewhere inside that closing coastal trap was Großdeutschland, the Army's fire brigade, now pinned in a situation no fire brigade could solve. From here, the legend starts to shrink. The division was jammed into the Memel Pocket with other German formations, including the 7th Panzer Division and the 58th Infantry Division. Landward, the Red Army pressed in. Behind them waited the sea. And the things keeping the pocket alive were not mainly the famous German tanks. They were naval guns and a strip of sand. Offshore sat heavy cruisers such as Prinz Eugen and Lutzow, throwing shells inland whenever Soviet formations massed for another attack. Naval gunfire could do what exhausted German armor could no longer do at scale: smash assembly areas from miles away and delay the collapse of the perimeter. That sound became part of the pocket's life. A distant ship, a flash, a delay bought in high explosive. The pride of German armor was being kept alive by the Navy. The other lifeline was the Curonian Spit, a long, narrow strip of sand and pine between the Baltic Sea and the lagoon. It was barely a line of survival, but for the trapped Germans it became everything. Ammunition, fuel, food, wounded men, orders, evacuation routes. All of it had to move through that fragile corridor or across water. Cut the spit, and Memel was finished. That is the image that shows how far Großdeutschland had fallen. This was a division built to spearhead attacks, to smash holes, to be the mailed fist at the front of a German counterstroke. Now its remaining Tigers and Panthers were being used as a doorstop. They covered withdrawals. They guarded exits. They fought defensive duels so battered units could pull back into Memel. A machine built for offense had become a rear guard on the edge of the sea. For several days, the division had no grand maneuver left. There was no brilliant armored breakout, no clean counterstroke that restored the map. No single German formation could be everywhere. That had always been the lie behind the fire brigade myth. A brilliant division can arrive at one crisis. It cannot arrive at all of them, especially when it has already spent its fuel, its veterans, and its tanks. Großdeutschland's survivors were folded together with other damaged formations, including battered infantry divisions and Volksgrenadier remnants. On paper, it looked like corps organization. In reality, it was debris arranged into military shape. When 5 broken formations have to be stapled together to create one fighting body, command has turned into triage. The remnants fell back toward Pillau, the port at the tip of the Samland Peninsula.